everybody. Welcome back to the channel. This is Nerd Level Rising. I'm Jake. I'm here with my good friend David from Four Corners of the Page here. What's up, David? Thank you for joining me.
I'm delighted to be here. Hi, Jake.
Amazing. I'm looking forward to this. We've been really excited for this for a while. We are here to
Wait, wait,
talk
wait, wait, wait,
about.
Jake. I'm gonna interrupt you. Wait, that was
Okay.
rubbish. Can I continue that? Hang on. Hello,
Yeah.
Jake. It's lovely to see you. You are brilliant. I am in deep admiration of your channel, and that was the most like formal, nothingy introduction. So I want to tell you properly. I admire you greatly, and I am genuinely very happy to be here. So apologies. Hello.
I
That's
love,
all.
that's amazing. Thank you so much. And obviously, I feel the same way about you. You have, I mean, you've recently passed 1,000 subscribers, right? Which is awesome. So more and more people are noticing. But right after we met, you very quickly became one of my favorite channels and one of my favorite people on BookTube. And it's been amazing to see more and more people getting on the David hype train. So
I appreciate that.
I'm honored to have you here, and your kind words make me want to cry out of pure joy.
I'll make
Because
you cry by the end of the call. That's my
I
goal.
sure hope so. That's my goal. Okay, so what are we here to talk about? We're here to talk about dragons. One of the best, maybe not best. I think it's one of the best, but of course that's up to subjective opinion. But one of the biggest mainstays in fantasy, anyway. And there's just some really interesting things to talk about with dragons, isn't there? And we've kind of brainstormed a list of little topics that, forgive me if you see me glance at my notes a little bit here and there, but we just want to kind of have a conversation like, why do we care about this so much? Why is it such a big part of the genre? What does it represent? How can it serve the story? All that kind of stuff. And we'll get into a few examples by the end. And we want to be very conscious of not spoiling things for people. So we're going to keep everything as vague as we possibly can while still bringing up some examples that can uh, illustrate some of the stuff that we're talking about. But please be wary. If you want to be completely blind into a story, you might want to skip through little bits and pieces of that. And I'll try to add timestamps to describe each series that we might discuss. But again, we'll keep it as vague and spoiler free as we possibly can. And I think I'm very spoiler sensitive. I glanced through, the notes I wrote down and the notes David wrote down. I would feel safe listening to them myself for whatever that's worth. But if you want to skip it, then feel free to skip it, and you'll just make both of us very sad. You don't want that. So, okay, well, why don't we start with just as simple as like, why are we so interested in dragons? Why have they been around they've been around for a very, very long time. You know a little bit more about this than I do about some of the origins. I just did a little bit of research, a little bit of digging into some of these early representations that we get. But maybe we start with the mommy dragging Tiamat, right?
Yeah.
What do you think? How do you want to? I'll let you kind of lead that one, and then I'll jump in a little bit because I've been talking
So
for a minute.
Or I'd say that you're vastly overselling my 30-minute Google that I did the other day. I should maybe preface this. Is this okay, Jake? Neither of us, I think we would say are dragon experts, right? We are not the
Right.
people who we see a book and there's a dragon on the cover and we go, oh, goody. Like
Yes.
neither of us are those people, right? But at the same time, those people exist. And aside from, I was thinking about this the other day, I think there's no other thing in fantasy except for magic that people associate more with fantasy. It
Mm,
seems to be one of the, if not the mainstay. I
yeah.
can't think of anything that kind of trumps it except from just magic in general. And magic is so
Sure.
kind of broad that like, okay. But in terms of like concrete objects or things, I agree with you totally, man. I think dragons are right at the top. So we do have this fascination with dragons. And it seems to, as you were just saying, have gone back kind of centuries and centuries and centuries. So I think your question is an appropriate one, which is where did it all begin? And the answer is I don't know, but I did do a Google. Uh, and so you just mentioned the mommy dragon. I'm British, so I'm going to say mummy dragon, if you
Okay.
forgive me. Um, it seems as though most sources point towards this Babylonian goddess,
hmm
goddess called Tiamat, who is also sometimes described as, and maybe we can find a link for this below so we can get fact checked.
Yeah.
Is a dragon-like, almost serpent-like entity that existed before the world as we know it existed. And
hmm
actually, according to my research, it was Tiamat's death that separated the heavens and the earth and brought forth order from chaos. I mean, a lot of dragon stuff seems to center around chaos versus order. I don't know if you noticed
Yeah.
that, mate.
I did. I did.
Yeah.
Even just thinking about, you think of like some examples that you've read in books, and it's like that seems to be a pretty common theme. And apparently, that has been a thing since the beginning of dragons, right? Which is
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah. Can I get biblical on you as well?
Please do.
Okay, so the other, and I guess I have a little bit more biblical literacy than I do Babylonian literacy. Um, Dragons are mentioned in the Bible. I don't know if you were aware of this before kind of doing the research for this video.
No, no.
Dragons are mentioned, so it gets a bit spurious, okay? Because according to the different, because obviously the Bible was not written in English, written in a bunch of ancient languages. I think Hebrew, was it Aramaic and Greek. Or I
Okay.
forget what the second language is. Forgive me. But three languages. And so when you're looking at these words like dragon, there might be a sense that the translation is being
Mm.
massaged a little bit there. So I think in the book of Isaiah, there's a mention of a dragon, but that could be interpreted as serpent. But there's one word in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, which is almost certainly dragon. It seems to be dragon seems to be the best translation of that Greek word. And if you like, I can read that passage to you because it's very heavy metal.
Yeah, let's do it. That sounds
Do you
great.
mind? Okay, so this is from the end of the world. Spoiler. You said no spoilers, but we're about to go proper end of the world spoilers for all of humanity. So here we
Yeah.
go. So Revelation chapter 20, verse 1, 2, and 3. Um, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And this is when the heavy metal music starts playing.
Mhm.
And he took hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him so that he would not deceive the nations any longer. So I'm not going to go into a big kind of interpretation of the book of Revelation, which is far beyond me. However, it is interesting as well that when was the book of Revelation written? 1900, 2000 years ago? Even then, as well, it's not just that dragons connote chaos, but there's a very clear articulation here that dragons are connotative, if that's a word, of evil, of
Mhm.
destruction. Like there's a very clear line here between the worst of the Bible, which is Satan, and dragons. It's a very clear, very stark image, and I'm wondering what you think about that, or what kind of perks up in your mind as we read those passages.
Yeah, I love that, and thanks for finding the passage. I think that's great to be able to read it, and like it would make a great fantasy book. Right? That's kind of cool. But yeah, I think that was my initial thought as well. That this is really that idea, that connotation has really permeated how we still view dragons today, and I think even to the extent that some a lot of dragons now have been deliberately shown to be the opposite of that. You know, we as we'll talk about, there have been some that like they're just very pure and good, which may very well have just been a statement on like, hey, not it doesn't have to be evil, right? It can be this thing as well. And in my research, I was having trouble finding like origins and earliest examples, but I know a lot of Eastern dragons have not fit that mold so much. They've been more like wise and noble and things like that. And they're typically depicted differently as well. They don't look like giant lizards so much as they look more like a snake or more like um, the example I always think about is if anyone is familiar with Shenron from Dragon Ball Z, right? The very, very long body, small legs, uh, things like that. And he usually has some sort of beard or something too, right? But
I think. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, just to kind of sum that up, that yes, that really it feels like these early ideas, like the chaos with Tiamat and the just otherworldly power associated with that, and then also the evil and destruction associated with what we get from the Bible, that those have been the things that have just really driven so much of how we still view dragons today.
I just wanted to jump in and say you made a really good point as well, bringing it to other continents and other regions. Because of course, like China is famous for its dragon lore, if you like, its dragon heritage, pedigree. I don't know what you'd call it, but like if
Sure.
you walk through China, the dragon is such a ubiquitous symbol, or it seems to be.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to overstretch my knowledge of Chinese literacy, which is this. But it's a really good point to raise that this creature or kind of set of interrelated creatures seems to pop up in a number of cultures and societies. It's something that almost like as a human consciousness we enjoy. And I wonder why that is. Why do we have that fascination with this? Because let's face it, right? Okay, can I tell you my opinion on dragons a little bit? Okay?
Do.
And I know that we're having a discussion on dragons, so what I'm about to say seems a bit defeating. or defeatist, I'm not sure I understand why people love dragons. Um, do you know what I mean? Because, like, in the same way some people are fascinated with horses, it seems to be. Some people just love horses, man, and everything is, like, oh, they're these amazing, beautiful creatures. And I feel like
Yeah.
in some ways, dragons are the fantasy horses, in which I mean that some people just seem to adore them and gravitate towards them and are super attracted to them. And they'll see a book with a dragon on the cover and they'll go, yes, I'm going to buy that book. And I think what you've kind of put in this Google Doc that no one else can see, this is a very obvious segue that I'm cluing everyone else in on, is the fact that some of us, I mean, all of us to some extent, and some of us to a really large extent, are fascinated by these creatures. They permeate our cultural consciousness. And I'm wondering if you could give us maybe a couple of ideas about why that is. Why is it that dragons seem to hold such a hold on our brains in the way that something like maybe phoenixes don't, or other kind of fantasy creatures? Why is it dragons
Yeah.
and not something like the phoenix?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if it goes back to those roots, right, that we just sort of discussed, because I think some of it is, um, I find maybe this is a bit of a pessimistic view of humanity. I don't know if you agree with this or not, David, but I think a lot of humans are fascinated with the darker side of existence.
Yeah.
You can see all the true crime shows, you can see all the documentaries of the Holocaust, and like although everyone, one of their favorite things to learn about in school is World War II. Why? Because it's horrible, right?
Yeah.
And like people just are drawn to those things. And dragons really represent a lot of the chaos and the death and the destruction. And I think people are in some ways drawn to that. I think it's in some way a promise of what sort of story you're going to get. That there's going to be high stakes, that there's going to be danger, that there's
Mm.
going to be adventure, and potentially, especially in some older, more classic work, there's going to be a build up towards defeating this thing. You get that catharsis at the end. Um, and of course,
Mm.
not every story has that. Sometimes the dragons aren't the big bad that we have to defeat. It's just another aspect of the story. But I think there's that stuff. I think when we get into um, some of the we mentioned some of the more Eastern representations. There's this idea of like spirituality and uh, and wisdom, and sometimes like prophecy and things like that that we can fold in there. And those things, of course, are huge aspects of the fantasy genre as well. It's not just sword and sorcery. Sometimes we get some of this other stuff that's much more thematic and much more. I hesitate to say deeper because it makes it sound like those other stories don't matter as much, but it just explores some different things.
Yeah.
You get the horror aspect of dragons. You get the I think about like my anxiety would be crazy. Can you imagine walking outside and seeing this thing? Like it's
Yeah.
just that idea. And then at the end of the day, also a lot of fantasy. We talk about book covers, for example, or even movies or whatever. A lot of it seems to be marketed a little bit more towards an audience that just thinks it's cool, right? Like it just
Yeah.
looks cool. There's something about it. The huge leathery wings and the dagger-like teeth and the claws and the fire breathing, and it's like they're just cool things. Of
Yeah.
course, not everybody thinks it's cool, but it's one of those things you see on a poster, you see on a walking by the bookshelf or whatever, and like you said, it grabs your attention. You just want to go buy it because it looks cool. So those are some of my ideas. I'd be interested to hear if you have any other ones or if you have any thoughts that any of those kind of tee up or anything like that.
Well, I do, but first of all, I've got to ask you, do you gravitate towards the dark?
I do a little bit. Believe it or not, I do tend to like the darker aspect. Well, there's an interesting layer to this. I do. I've always really loved Halloween and like any sort of like gothic imagery. Or if anyone's watched my channel, you notice I almost always wear black and like things like this, tattoos, etc. But I'm scared of almost everything, and like I'm really not a very tough person. And so I think about it's a weird place to be, that like in terms of the imagery and the vibe, very here for it. I would never want to like be in some sort of situation like this in real life. It just would not work for me.
Wake me up inside.
Yeah.
No, listen, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, so I don't mean to spin us off. But I think you're actually getting to something really important there. We always talk about literature and books and movies. One of the advantages to that is it lets us see from someone else's perspective, right? When we read a novel from some other culture's perspective, or maybe a neurodivergent perspective, we get to, in a small sense, get clued in on what that's like. Um, and so I think there's a case to be made that we gravitate towards the darker things because we do want to know what that's like. And we want to be able to experience that and understand it. I'm actually quite a hopeful, optimistic guy sometimes. And I still also gravitate towards the darker sides of literature. And sometimes I wonder if that's good for me. You know, I'm reading R. Scott
Sure.
Baker right now, who also has dragons in his stuff, by the way. But there's a case to be made that I like reading R. Scott Baker because it shows me a different way of seeing things, even if that way of seeing things
Mm,
is pretty grim. And
yeah.
maybe it's important for me to understand my own perspective. It's important for me to understand my own perspective more by seeing the flip side, by
Yes.
seeing the inversion. So I no, I totally agree with what you're saying, even though I just sang Evanescence at you.
Yeah.
But I also think that you raise a good point about, and we haven't talked about the size of dragons. I don't know if you've been to any of these museums where they give you like a life-size dinosaur or something like that. Have you
No.
ever experienced one? So, where I used to live in Kuwait, there's a really good museum. It's called the Cultural Center, or one of them. But in this cultural center, they have a dinosaur exhibition, this big old warehouse type room. And inside this warehouse type room, they have life-size dinosaurs that you can kind of meander through and walk around. And the
Whoa.
one that always, actually, this is really interesting, if I do say so myself. There's one dinosaur that absolutely floored me. Do you know the dinosaur Quetzalcoatlus?
No.
Right, okay, I'm gonna just very quickly look that up for you. So this is a bird-like dinosaur. I'm gonna misspell this. Quetzalcoatlus. You will know it. It looks like that.
Oh, okay.
Quetzalcoatlus. Okay, I misspelled
Interesting.
it, but that's fine. Big bird-like thing, big long elongated beak, leathery wings. And they have Quetzalcoatlus kind of standing on its haunches like this. That's the pose. So what you can do literally is you can stand in the shadow of the wings of Quetzalcoatlus, and
Mm.
you get a sense of how big this thing is. And it's staggeringly huge. It's about 3 times the size of a man. Um, and I remember, I mean, I was trying to keep track of my 4-year-old as he was running riot and annoying everyone. But that's a joke. I love my son to pieces. But I remember taking like 5 seconds, which as a parent is a huge amount of time, 5 seconds to stand under this dinosaur. And my jaw was on the floor because it really gave me this immense, again, sense of terror, sense of
Yeah.
anxiety at how big this thing really was. I mean, this thing could field a T-Rex, I imagine. And so I think, and the reason that I'm finding this so fascinating, hearing you talk about this and it's setting off these reactions in me, is I can't think of any beast more proximal to the dragon
Mm.
than Quetzalcoatlus, the dinosaur.
Yeah.
And suddenly, as you're talking, I'm beginning to be like, oh, now I get it. I now begin to understand what people are seeing there. I don't know. I find that
Yeah.
really interesting real world connection.
I the more I think about this, the more I think that like it's almost like a cosmic horror feeling of like
Mm,
you feel powerless and like there is no way humanity could stand up against this thing. I don't know if this might sound really weird. When I was a kid, I used to do this all the time. I'd be outside and I'd look up and see the clouds in the sky, and maybe they're like these weird kind of uh, I don't know, hazy, kind of choppy clouds. They're not the nice big fluffy clouds that we all think about when we think of a cloud, but they're kind of I don't know the technical term. But and I would look up and I would see and I like that kind of in a weird way looks like when you run your tongue along the roof of your mouth and you feel those ridges.
yes.
I'm like, it almost kind of looks like that. What if we're being swallowed by this gigantic Like I would think about this as a kid. What if this giant monster is swallowing the earth whole? And I would just feel this immense horror at the thought. And I think about that like with dragons, just like the size and there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do. You need another dragon, right? So it's the more I think about it, the more I think that really is certainly not the only reason, but a major reason why we find them so interesting. Just like serial killers, just like all this, these monsters of our own history that we are fascinated by. And maybe it's like you said, it's to understand our perspective in contrast to it, or to, just to, I don't know, in some ways understand the depths of humanity, or maybe what humanity can dream up in the case of a dragon, or that sort of thing.
I mean, first of all, the monster exists and it's called climate change.
Yeah.
Second of all, it's interesting. The Romantics, I believe, and this was from my university days a long time ago. I believe the Romantics called it the sublime, right? This idea of
Mm,
like a volcanic eruption or looking out at the ocean and getting a sense of how huge nature is
yeah,
and actually how small we are. Not even, I mean, you mentioned cosmic horror, which is a brilliant point, but even just taking it down to the global level, how incapable we are of dealing with the nature in our own world. That we look at a volcanic eruption and the best we can do is flee.
yeah,
We look at tsunami like 2004, the Boxing Day tsunami in Indonesia, and the havoc that wreaked on us. So the Romantics had this word from like the sublime, which is the feeling of awe you get at your own powerlessness in the face of
mm,
nature. And maybe that's kind of akin to
yeah,
what we're talking about. Because I also think, although we're talking about their kind of, we've touched on their magical roots, but I also think dragons are very often connected to the natural world in a way that we often aren't. Dragons often seem to be sort of an inversion of humanity where we have kind of taken ourselves away from the natural world by machines or by kind of self-indulgent introspection on ourselves. Whereas dragons often, it seems to be in fiction, stay true to the natural world and they're much more close to nature
yeah,
than we can ever hope to be. I don't know what you think
yeah.
about that.
I think that's a brilliant point. And you see a lot of times like elemental dragons. You'll see fire dragons, earth dragons, whatever,
Exactly.
right? Even
Yeah.
more so tied to even Tiamat, right? Was tied to nature and the creation of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great insight. I like that a lot.
Yeah. I like some of the stuff that you've written down in our secret Google Doc as well. So I'm looking at, do you mind if I look at
Yeah,
how dragons serve a story? What Jake's
yeah.
not telling you is that he assembled this Google Doc and it is fabulous. And he's going to publish it as a
I
research paper
might.
at some
I might. I
point.
might.
But you've got a bunch of ideas, not just about why we're attracted to dragons as a readership, but also how dragons actually serve a story. And I'm not going to talk about this because I feel like I'd be plagiarizing your ideas, mate. So if you don't mind us kind of moving on to that section, you've written a lot of really interesting things about how dragons serve a story that I think deserve exploration. Would you mind?
Awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course, I would love to. And I also should say the other thing that now David's not telling you is that I made this Google Doc with the sole purpose of impressing David. That I just did not want him to read this and be like, bro, what are you doing? Like, I'm going to do this video with somebody else. So, mission accomplished, it sounds like. I did okay.
Very much mission accomplished if that was your goal.
It was the goal. It was the goal. I didn't fail. Maybe I got a passing grade in the class at least.
A
But
star, mate.
all right, all right. So I think there was three major things that I kind of thought about. One being my personal favorite type of dragon, which what this says about me, I don't know. But this is like just the pure horrifying war machine destruction kind of dragon. Because I think that that embodies the thing that, like you said, that feeling of awe and powerlessness and all that. A lot of those things we were just talking about, this really shows that. And I think one of the ways I kind of think about it too, and I got this, I had this thought myself, but it was driven home even more. I had the chance to talk to Ryan Cahill on my channel a little while ago, and his books have these dragons, this type of dragon. And what he said as well is like, think of him like a nuclear weapon. Like the fact that one side has one means if we're going to deploy this thing, we need to really think about it because the other side is going to have to do something in return that's equally destructive. Otherwise, they're just rolling over. And so it completely changes the game when you have war in your story, and it changes the stakes. It changes it literally changes the world right at the end of it sometimes. And so I think that's one thing that it raises the stakes. We have all of the power scaling that comes with that, just all of that destruction, horror, powerlessness. I think there's also we mentioned the Eastern dragons and how we can also have this really spiritual side of things that I think equally humans are really interested in this, right? There's tons of people that like this is their life work, their life mission is to learn more about spirituality and spread these messages and just be as positive as they possibly can. And I think you get a ton of that out of dragons, right? That sense of wonder, that sense
Mm.
of um, the divine, right? The sense of being there's somebody out there looking out for you, is somebody who can help you if you seek it out. And it's a much more, I think, optimistic view. There's like this sense that things will be okay, and maybe it's still going to be hard, but ultimately it'll work out. I think is sort of the underlying feeling that I get at least from that.
Mhm.
And then the third aspect is sort of the you know, uh, 5-year-old boy wish fulfillment of I just want this cool thing that I can ride
I'm
and go
listening.
out and have this cool adventure, right? And to me, that's like the dragon rider fantasy, the pet, the companion, the you have this amazing friend you have this bond with who is never going to leave you, right? Some of that maybe is a relationship dynamic thing that we all sort of look up to. And yeah, I want to touch on this because
Yeah,
I never
something like
read
that,
this.
right? Exactly.
Yes, exactly, right. So you get some of that that bond relationship adventure kind of feel that doesn't feel as dark, doesn't feel as scary to me. Sometimes these dragons are they get a personality, right? That feels more like just another character, right? Or maybe they talk sometimes even. So those are like the three big ones that I came up with, right? So let me pass it back to you, see what you think.
I think so. First of all, I should say I haven't read this book. I'm holding it up as an example, having not read the first page. This is Wild Skies by Katie Andrews, and apparently it's an example of dragons as companions is probably the best word. I know, but pets is also there. Aragon is also. Ah, look at that! Look,
I
yours
just,
is
I just,
shinier than mine.
bro, I just got the broken binding set, and
That is gorgeous.
I, I almost fell over when I opened this. I'm not gonna lie. This is an extremely nostalgic story for me, and
Yeah.
so very worth the money. These are beautiful. Anyway,
Was it your gateway fantasy as well? It was
it,
mine.
it was. I had
Yeah.
read some other stuff before, but this was the first thing I picked up for myself. Nobody handed me this. I just found it in the library. Funny enough, because it had a dragon on the cover, and picked it up and loved it.
Do you know what? Eragon gets a lot of flack, doesn't it? Lots of people like to make fun of Eragon.
Yeah,
And I haven't read it since I was a teenager, but what I can tell you is I think I must have been 14, 15, and like you, I checked it out at the school library. You know how sometimes you check stuff out of a library and you don't end up reading it and it just sits there and then it
yeah.
goes back. And I kind of had that vibe with Eragon. I'm like, oh, maybe I'll get to it. So I read like 200 pages, like non-stop. I really am indebted to Eragon, and I don't talk about this enough. I'm indebted to Eragon for
Yeah.
really being a large part of why I got into reading as a teenager,
Yeah.
certainly an early teenager. And I think one thing that I know it's easy to say, it's facile, it's simple, Eragon. I think there are probably hundreds of thousands of people whose reading life is bigger than it would have otherwise been. If Eragon, we'll touch on Ericsson in a minute, if
Mhm.
Eragon were not published. And I sometimes think, sorry, I'm derailing us again, but sometimes I think we like to be mean to Eragon to demonstrate how far we've come as a reader since then. And I think people do the
Mm.
same thing with Brandon Sanderson. It's not really about the author themselves. It's about, and this is from someone who's been making fun of Wind and Truth for about 3 months. Often it's not about the book itself. It's about we trying to justify to ourselves how far we've come in our own reading lives. And I
Mm.
think Eragon, I can't think of any other book that gets more flack, undeserved flack, because it's a kid's book written by a kid. And
Right.
sorry, I'm going away now just to hype Christopher Paolini.
Yeah, it's great,
Because
and he seems like a
yeah,
super nice guy. I've seen a couple
yeah,
of interviews with him. He seems amazing.
yeah.
I'm interested in reading. I don't know if anyone listening has read Murtaugh. I want to go back and read that and see how he's evolved as a writer when he went back to I think he's going to go do more stuff in the world now too. Uh, Funny enough, it could be
Yeah.
fun. We could we should do some sort of video or something. I know if you're familiar with Vera, her channel, she was a huge
Yeah,
Aragon person.
she's
She used to
great.
do the greeting, right? And it'd be fun to just talk about how cool Aragon actually is, right? Give it its flowers. But anyway,
Yeah.
continue.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I love these three different ways that you've identified that dragons can serve a story. And I derailed us, so I'm going to repeat them: War Machine, Wise and Philosophical, and Pets Companions were the three kind of major categories that you created. And I think those categories are totally fair. I think what's interesting though is the way, although these categories seem to be mutually exclusive, like, can you really have a chaotic war machine that is also intensely philosophical? Can you have a chaotic war machine that's like a nuclear bomb that's also a friend? These things seem to be sort of clashing off each other, but the reality is, the more we think about specific examples of dragons in fantasy, the more I find personally that not many dragons, some do, but not many dragons fit neatly into one of these three slots. They sort of
Yes.
tangle together. And that's what I think also makes dragons interesting is that maybe these days, dragons aren't really anything. They are vessels that authors use and insert their own kind of connotations into. Okay, so of course dragons are always big and they're always, fire breathing. But in terms of what you're getting from each dragon in each specific text, often that can look very different. And I think that's because authors are sort of braiding and combining different elements that you've identified to create their own specific dragons.
Yeah. I
Yeah, I
couldn't
don't know what
agree
you think
more.
about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think a lot of the examples that I had jotted down as well were are like that, and I think um, you like I'll go and spoil one really quick. That to me, my sorry, spoil one of the ones we jotted down was in Song of Ice and Fire.
Mm.
That to me, what jumped out immediately was like these are one of them is called the Black Dread, right? Like these are gigantic, terrifying monsters that destroy cities, but they still have other aspects too, even though like to me that's the thing that comes to mind immediately. Like you brought up a really good point that it does have other layers to it, right? It shows this idea of well here I'll let you explain it because I think you wrote it down very nicely. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Well, um, I think with the Song of Ice and Fire Dragons, they're really interesting examples because they are war machines. And I haven't watched House of the Dragon, but my understanding is in House of the Dragon, the war machine angle is boosted even more.
Ooh.
These things are terrifying. They fight. They can just level landscapes. I mean, we're spoilers now, right? For Game of Thrones.
Yeah, sure, we can we'll give a quick spoiler warning. I'll put it in the what do you call that, timestamp, so people can skip it if they want to.
So, I mean, people make fun of the ending of Game of Thrones quite rightly. Um, that dragon at the end levels a city and does it pretty easily. These things are, even when they're reduced as they are at the end of A Song of Ice and Fire, they're still capable of severe damage. So yeah, war machines, nuclear bombs, as you said. I mean, I
Yeah,
think you could probably draw a comparison between King's Landing and something like Hiroshima.
sure.
However, at the same time, they are friends and companions to the Targaryens. Um, and they're not chill companions all the time, but there does seem to be intelligence there. There does seem to be kinship there. What's really interesting, though, about the dragons, and I'm not sure if you agree or disagree, is that the dragons in A Song of Ice and Fire seem very volatile. They seem like they can flip, and you have
Yeah.
to be very respectful of them in case they flip. And I find that very interesting because what are the Targaryens in A Song of Ice and Fire except madmen who are famous for flipping on a dime? It's almost like
Yep.
the dragons are a symbolic representation of the Targaryens themselves. You know, the dragon, the most dragon-like people in that series. Maybe that's another point that dragons are very often tied to some kind of thematic concern within the text as a whole. I love the
Yeah.
Song of Ice and Fire Dragons. I love that scene in Game of Thrones, and it's also in the book where Arya is walking through the dungeons of King's Landing, and she finds all the ancient skulls of the dragons
Yeah.
before. That's such a powerful scene. But yeah, I love the Song of Ice and Fire Dragons. I think they're a really, really good example of that
Yeah.
that war machine and friend combination, if we want to call it that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think even well, I'll leave that for a second. I don't want to go through all of our examples just yet. I think we have an interesting point or two to make before we get to uh all those. But um I think maybe an interesting thing before we get to the examples might be like what makes an effective dragon to put in our story, right? Or to have in our story. And you just have an amazing example of having it tied thematically to what's going on, right? With the Targaryens. I think that's brilliant. Um, I think there's some points beyond just the thematic nature of how they're represented, how they act, how they uh, behave themselves in the world, those sorts of things. That even just like the design can influence how effective they are for the thing. So, for example, this is another thing that Ryan Cahill talked about when I talked to him is that if the dragon like speaks out loud, it immediately feels like YA. That's not a bad thing.
Interesting.
It's not a bad thing. It's just for most readers, they're going to take it that way. It feels a little bit less monstrous. It feels a little
Mhm.
bit less, chaotic and that sort of thing. Maybe it feels a little bit more magical. Maybe it feels a little bit more of some other things. But it's like that, or if it has, four limbs and wings versus just hind legs and wings. They just feel
Yes.
different, right? And so he was like describing when he made his dragons, he was very conscious of designing them physically in a certain way and that they don't speak out loud. Maybe that you can sense their emotions a little bit here and there, but they're not going to speak out loud. And how that deliberately shapes how the reader will feel about the dragon and therefore how well it fits that story. And yeah, I think another clear example of this to me is the Songs of Chaos books by Michael R. Miller. Those are very different. They speak out loud. I believe they have all four limbs. They are smaller. They have very strong personalities. They they are just another. They're like the friend character, right? And to me, and I do not mean this disparagingly in any way. they feel very, very YA to me, and there's very low stakes. Like obviously, I want the good guys to win or whatever, but I'm not like at the edge of my seat, like, oh please, what's going to happen? I'm terrified, right? Whereas in Song of Ice and Fire and Bound and the Broken or some of these other stories, it feels very different. It feels just more. Uh, I hate to use the word mature because that sounds bad, but it just feels darker. Maybe is a word, or
I
heavier.
I,
But
I wonder if that four legs two things thing is fascinating, right? Because I
yeah,
wonder if it's that with a four-legged creature we associate that with cats and
maybe
dogs and domestic animals, and obviously some animals also have two legs, chickens.
sure.
But we tend to associate two legs with humans, and so maybe there's a recognition of the inability that we have to control. Well, we are able to control each other, unfortunately, but there's less kind of a domestic connotation with something
Mm,
with two legs than four. That's
yeah,
really interesting. You know, I don't know if you saw my last video where I said I probably wouldn't enjoy Ryan Kyle, but
I don't
you're
know if I
kind
have
of
seen that one yet. I'm a little behind.
that's okay. Do your homework. No, just kidding. You you're begin. So I basically said, there was a question for me, of all the authors you think you wouldn't enjoy that you haven't read, who might be that author? And I said maybe Ryan Cahill because he seems a bit more traditional. But everything you're saying about Ryan Cahill demonstrates, well done, Ryan, a very clever, very clever forethought and conscious decision
Yeah,
making within that traditional fantasy sphere.
yeah.
So you are making me want to pick up
I
Bound and the
think
Broken a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the first book, I don't know if you'll love it. The first book is kind of like Eragon, right? Like it's very familiar. It's a lot of the tropes that we know. But what I will say, once you get into book three, especially, you look back at what happened in book one, and you're just
Yeah.
like, whoa, he planned this from the like he really did plan it. And I think it was deliberate to ease in people, catch some brand new readers, and then build out into his own. Kind of like Eye of the World was, it's
Yeah.
Fellowship of the Ring, right? But then he does his own stuff. He kind of brought people in and then took them on a ride. So yeah, I would hope you'd enjoy it. I like it a lot, right? I still haven't read book four, which drives me nuts, but
Yeah.
it's cool.
Um, is it for book for the final one? I got a bit confused because I saw him post something on his Instagram about a new book suddenly, and I'm confused.
Yeah, there will be five.
Okay.
The fourth one, he's working on getting the physical editions out now, and then there will be a novella sometime like the end of this year, early next year, I think, and then book five will wrap it up.
Is it self-pub?
Hmm. Well, for
Oh,
the most part, Broken Binding just picked him up. He's their first like trad pub thing that they're gonna do, but
amazing.
yeah, he's done it all himself and he's crushing it.
Ryan Cahill, if you're watching this, I do apologize for any words I might have said in a previous video. No, I think you raised a really good point about language and dragons. This is another really interesting insight that you've raised because you said this thing about as soon as dragons speak, they feel less commanding. But there's lots of little subcategories as well with dragons and language that I find
Sure.
really fascinating. I think, first of all, there's the fact that we, in stories, tend to, or I guess authors, I should say, sometimes give dragons a different name. I've noticed this. So
Mm,
in Malazan, the actual dragons are called Elaine, right? Um, and in R. Scott Baker's series, the dragons, I believe, are called Varaku or something like that.
okay.
Sometimes authors feel like they have to put their own stamp, their own linguistic
Yeah.
stamp on their own creations to kind of say, these aren't just dragons, these are my dragons.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering why they kind of make that move. So that's one way in that language and dragons are complicated. Within stories as well, dragons can communicate in a number of ways, right? So there can be mental kind of pushing back and forth, almost like what is it called, telepathy. Some dragons
Hmm.
are telepathic. Some dragons are more just like Pokemon, where they can say "Rrr,"
Yeah.
and that's it. And Charizard, what a good example of a dragon of Charizard.
Yeah.
Yeah, two
Yeah.
legs, by the way, Charizard. Anyway, and the other way that I think kind of language and dragon. Well, I was going to say one of my favorite examples of dragons that isn't from a book. I don't know if you've played Skyrim at all.
Not much. No.
So this is a real so Skyrim. Okay, it now has this reputation of being a bit of a silly video game. Skyrim does something amazing with dragons because what Skyrim does with dragons is it ties dialogue to magic. So when dragons fight in Skyrim, they're not using spells or they're not how can I say this? Words in the language of dragons in Skyrim are magic. So, for example, if a dragon says fire, that's how it blasts its fire. If a dragon says wind, that's how it summons wind. So you've got this really clever idea in Skyrim where dragons fighting, or a dragon fighting you, as the case may be, they're not fighting you, they're debating you.
Oh, interesting.
Which is one of the most clever little quirks that I've ever encountered with dragons. That tying together of language and violence
Yeah.
through the medium of dragons is wonderful. And I think if that was in a what can you call it, like a bigger not a bigger franchise because Skyrim is huge, but if it was bound up in a book, that would deserve a lot more kind of literary attention. I think it's a really clever little move.
You know what that reminds me of is there's just a sort of a niche stereotype of dragons where they're these very seductive, very persuasive, like Smaug, for example, right? And I think the Hobbit movies actually really show this in a way. Say what you will about the movies. I love how Smaug was in there. And like he's just so suave and smooth and he's so tempting and he's got that voice and he's sitting on his mound of gold and I wonder if that's where they sort of got that idea from of the debating and that sort of thing. That just that almost like Jedi mind trick that these dragons can pull out when they're talking to people.
I think it also comes back to dragons as the devil, right? Did God not say
Yeah.
that you could eat any fruit from the tree? That kind of
Yeah.
seductive, persuasive quality is also deeply rooted in the Bible. Especially, we've gone to Revelation and now we'll go back to Genesis. It's right there in
Sure.
Genesis too. Yeah, I think this is such an interesting thing. I think also if we're talking about kind of humans and their relationship with dragons, I think often humans in fiction are their power, and you spoke about this a little bit already. Their power level is indicated by the dragon they have and whether or not they have dragons. There's maybe a thing of like dragon as commodity. So if we go back to Eragon, right? Forgive me, does the bad guy of Eragon have dragons? No.
Yeah, I believe so.
He does, right?
The evil king guy. Yeah. Galbatorix. I remember little grade school me thought that was the coolest name ever.
I know, I know. It's better than you just finished the first book of Thomas Covenant, right?
I did.
High King Kevin. Has there ever been a better name than High King Kevin?
I have a theory about who Kevin is that would make that name make sense. Who knows if I'm right or not, but
I
I have
didn't
a
get past
theory.
book one, so
I
but
loved it, dude.
genuinely, did you?
Yeah.
I read it way too early. I think I read it at a time that I didn't quite, and I don't think I went in with the right expectations. I think I was expecting a Song of Ice and Fire, and I got
Hmm.
Gene Wolfe, and so that made me off.
Sure.
Um,
Fair.
yeah, but so going back to Aragon, let's face it, Aragon is nobody. He's just a dude. What makes Aragon interesting is that he finds this dragon egg, and the egg is the commodity, the thing that propels him to greatness. It's
Hmm.
almost like dragons are able to make us level up,
Yeah.
or maybe we're interpreting this through a kind of a social lens, allows him to gain privilege to access areas of the world that he wouldn't otherwise be able to.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah,
sort of like
totally.
inheritance or something like that, or yeah.
Yeah, something. I wonder why they named the series that.
Ah, very
Uh,
good. Yeah.
but yeah, in some ways you could almost even look at it like it can make you the chosen one, right? Which
Yeah.
wraps in that part of fantasy too. And it just yeah, I love that point, especially with the Dragon Rider stuff. We see that, but even outside, if like even if they're not riding the dragons, just having the dragon makes you such a wild card, right? And people want to make sure they're on your good side, like we talked about earlier with the especially when you get into like the pure destruction kind of dragons. It's like we there's such a fear of that thing coming against you. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And just the uh, how high those stakes are that makes the interpersonal dynamics almost regardless of the dragon just so much different because there's that huge fear that you could pull parallels to our own world, I think, in that sense. Um,
Yeah,
but
absolutely. And
yeah.
you know what? Just as you're telling that, there's an interesting thing as well that often the people who get dragons, they obtain dragons, they often become more draconic. It's
Mm,
almost like it kind of
hmm.
alters their personality to make them more fearful and intimidating. And I
Yeah.
wonder there might be some kind of analogy there where someone who suddenly accrues a lot of wealth is corrupted, and someone who accrues a whole amount of social capital could be corrupted by that. I
Yeah.
mean, you always hear stories about people who make it big as celebrities and then suddenly they become nasty people. And maybe
Sure.
there's an analogy there with dragons.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think you're probably right. I think you're probably
yeah.
right.
Were there any other examples of dragons that you wanted to touch on?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of touched on a couple already. We talked about
Yeah.
Game of Thrones dragons or Song of Ice and Fire. We talked about Smaug a little bit. I want to make sure we brought him up because the Tolkien scholars will hate us if we don't. We talked about
We're
Kyle stuff,
avoiding Beowulf, aren't we? We're both
Eragon,
avoiding Beowulf.
Beowulf. Philip,
Yeah,
please show up and help us.
yeah.
Philip,
I
please.
have read Beowulf. I just don't feel qualified to talk on that dragon.
I don't either. I read a abridged version back in high school.
Yeah.
All I really remember, I don't even really remember the dragon very much, to be honest with you. I remember Grendel, unless Grendel is the dragon, which shows my lack of knowledge there. But
Philip, Philip.
send help, send help. We'll see. I will. I kind of want to not tag him and just see if he happens to see this and watches this far into the video and comments. That'd be pretty funny.
Yeah.
Um, I mentioned the Michael R. Miller stuff. You had an interesting. You mentioned Baker, and at least I don't know if we mentioned it here or not, but you mentioned Hobb to me earlier that there was some interesting take there. I would love to hear what you had to say about what she does.
Okay, so I'm gonna say if you're very spoiler averse, maybe stay away. Because I'm gonna try my best to keep it vague, but dragons are an important part of Realm of the Elderlings, and I haven't finished Realm of the Elderlings, so from the first 9 books is where I'm going to draw this from. And I'm going to be quite spoiler sensitive, but it's tricky. It's tricky to navigate. So if you're spoiler sensitive, stay away and come back after I'm done, which you should do anyway. So there are multiple kinds of dragons in Hob. So what's interesting about Hobb's dragons is how I think, and I'm going to keep it quite vague here. There's two types. You got the real dragons, and they're really interesting because they are aware of how amazing they are, and they're very smug. Hobbs dragons. They are aware that they are greater than humanity, and you often get a sense with Hobbs dragons that you feel like a worm in comparison to these dragons. You feel like you're nothing, and you are aware that they think you're nothing. So these dragons demand sacrifice. They demand you to bow down to them, essentially, in Robin Hobb's world, at least as far as I've read. And at the same time, they're strangely weak. You do get a sense of the fragility of the dragons. And I think there's maybe an ecological tie in there to our real world. I mean, I joked about climate change earlier. But I mean, if you think about it, what better analogy for our world where we are completely at its mercy and yet it's never been more fragile? So in fact, I'm going to leave this discussion here because I'm so terrified of spoilers. But there really is this. I don't think anyone tackles the kinship between dragons and nature as well as Robin Hobb does. Now, I haven't read the last 7 books, so she could totally go off the deep end, especially because the next 4 books in Robin Hobb's series that they're called the Rainwild Chronicles are Dragon Haven, Dragon City, Dragon, Dragon, Dragon. So I'm sure there's more to come that I'm not aware of. But I do find the ecological environmental aspect of dragons in Robin Hobb's writing really interesting, really interesting. And I hope you get to Robin Hobb soon, Jake.
Me too. Dude, the only reason I haven't done it yet is because I know it's going to be one of my favorite things ever, and I just don't want it to be over yet.
Yeah.
I'm
There's
excited.
their little series. You can just do a trilogy and then
Yeah,
look at
that's
that.
true. That's true. Yeah, I really need to. I really need to do that sooner rather than later.
Now
Um,
you've read more of Philip's. Speaking of Philip, of the Edan trilogy than I have. Um,
yeah.
I am okay with you kind of broaching this topic totally.
Okay.
I'd be curious how you feel about Way of Edan, the Edan trilogy's treatment of dragons.
Yeah. So I'll still be as vague as I can just for anybody else who's watching, but um, the and you read the first book.
Yeah.
So you don't really see anything in the first book, right? It's not a massively prominent part of the story, but it is yet an important part as we get deeper into the trilogy. And I think that Philip does some really, really cool things with, as we talk about, sort of combining some of these different types of dragons that we might see. And we see um, some just amazing battle scenes just on surface level, right? So we see that destruction, we see the power that they have. But I think much more importantly, we see the thematic tie to the story that we have from a certain character. We see it's focused a bit more on what I think of as sort of a corruption of the companionship type of dragons that we see. That it's more domination in some ways that I thought was really interesting.
Mm.
Interesting way to think about that and to see how that plays out. Because you still have the common, whenever we see Dragon Rider stuff, they usually influence each other. Like you said, the people become a bit more draconic, and sometimes we'll see if the dragons are a little bit more humanized, so to speak, they start to become a little bit, more human in that way. I think that still happens, but with that twist on how the companionship is happening, I think it was really cool. And then we also see this idea of this the dragons being this force of nature, this really wise, this really uh, like they have the secrets, like they're divine, right? We see an interesting take on that. That the way that both of those twists that Philip does really influence how the story goes. I just loved, and I hadn't seen that myself, right? At least in anything else that I've read personally. So I just thought it was awesome and deserves some praise. And speaking of, we are recording this on, oh, I should have grabbed mine. We are recording this on June 21st, which is release day of his sequel book called Wild Darkness Gathers that has a dragon on the
Yeah.
cover. So congrats, Philip, if you see this. But it has a dragon on the cover. So I'm hoping to see some more dragons in that book. That would be very cool.
They're chunky boys, Philip's
They
books.
are
I'm so
indeed.
glad. I read the first one digitally, and I really didn't want to.
Yeah.
Partly because I really wanted the map and things like
Yeah.
that.
It's a cool map.
I'm excited to get back into it and read it. This is actually a really like I know the Broken Binding are doing a great job with we should call him Chase, shouldn't we? Because he's an author with Chase's
Yeah.
stuff. But you know what? I think these original releases are actually really lovely as
They're
well.
great. They feel really
Yeah.
good in your
They
hands,
feel
like the
really
texture.
like I love an aesthetic ergonomic novel. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I
So I'm
absolutely
excited
do.
to get into these.
Yeah. I
I'm
think
not
you'll,
excited for paying the luggage allowance on my flight to Tokyo, but
ah,
I'll send Philip an invoice. It's fine.
there, there you go. There you go. All of his hopefully we get some more sales from this video. You can send those proceeds over to fund your shipping. But
Can I touch on another dragon that I think is really interesting? And I'm not going to say very much on it,
okay.
partially because I spoiled the whole thing, and partially because I haven't read it in a few years. But Red Country by Joe Abercrombie is really interesting, and I can't speak about it at all. But if you read Red Country, you'll know what I'm talking about. Have you finished the standalones? You have? No.
I've not. I have not.
Yeah. Red Country, it's very interesting to read it as a twisted interpretation of The Hobbit, is all I'll say. Um, so in The Hobbit, you obviously have these characters going to tackle the dragon on the mountain. Um, and I feel like I don't know if Abercrombie was doing this deliberately, but the ideas he tackles in Red Country, although it's marketed as a Western, to me reads like a deliberate grimdark response to The Hobbit. And it's
Huh.
very interesting reading it that way with that kind of that because they go to find the dragon people is what they're called. And that's all I can say because I don't want to spoil it because I think
Yeah.
Red Country is a fabulously misunderstood book. And it's just worth reading. So if you read it through
Oh
the lens of
man.
The Hobbit, you will get so much out of it. Um,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah.
I'm
I
very
have
excited to read those.
I have two more I wanted to talk about, but I want to pass this one to you because how do you feel about the dragons in Malazan?
Well, I wanted to make sure we talked about that. That was the other one I wanted to make sure that we highlighted.
Yeah.
I think they're very complicated. It's almost hard for me to talk about.
Mhm.
Um, what stands out to me the most, I think, is that they feel the word that came to mind when I jotted down the note about it was like primordial, right? Like they're
Mhm.
ancient and they feel in some ways all powerful. In other ways, they feel tired and like
Yes.
they've just been holding this weight for so long. And holding the weight not only of like their deeds and what they need to do, but also holding the weight of their power and their influence and like how do they navigate all this stuff. And that's really the feeling I get the most. And when they are unleashed, they are crazy and destructive, but it feels like they're not out that much, right? They're very they feel very reserved in some ways.
Yes.
And I think the other thing that I always think about is um, I won't even say the book because I don't want to spoil that, but like in one of the books, there is a dragon that I think does such a great job of representing the sort of dual nat like even going back to the beginning of this conversation with Tiamat and sort of the destruction that caused the birth of the planet and all that kind of stuff, right? Like this idea of magic existing, but also something that can counter that all in one package. And I just thought
Yeah.
that was such an interesting way to show that. And it's one of those. I mean, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like there is a scene involving this creature that is just seared into my brain that I just can't get that mental image out of my head.
Yeah.
And it's just such a, they just feel so powerful to me. Those are my, I guess, general thoughts.
Can I say we're doing amazing avoiding spoilers?
I hope
We're doing
so.
such a good job because I
Yeah.
know that before starting this discussion, we were worried about spoiling things.
Yeah.
I think we're threading this needle very well. I would agree with all of what you said. I think that one other aspect I would add to the dragons in Malazan, obviously they're primordial, and actually I think their magic system is actually tied to the chaos magic. I could be wrong there. I need to check that, or they're next door to chaos or something like that.
Sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But there's also the fact that in Malazan, some people are shapeshifters and can turn into dragons. And I think this goes back to what we were saying about people becoming draconic when they are connected to dragons because they're called soul taken in Malazan. You know, some people are soul taken dragons, some people are soul taken whatever. So you could potentially be a soul taken rooster. But the people who are soul taken dragons are the ones who are already draconic. There's kind of a chicken and an egg situation there. Are they allowed to be soul taken dragons because they're already themselves draconic, or have their draconic elements shifted them? I mean, one character in Malazan is soul taken character in Malazan is famously mates, and I mean that in the romantic sense, with a dragon. So like there's that kind of ambiguity there that ties back to our people who are connected to dragons kind of being, is corrupted the word here, molded
Mm.
by that draconic element.
Yeah.
I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
I love dragons in Malazan. And
Yeah. They're,
there's some really good dragon quotes which I've written down in the Google Doc, but I
yeah.
can't say to keep your channel free of profanity. But yeah,
I mean, the free of profanity isn't really that much of a concern. Every time I talk about One Piece, Alex from Iskandari will slip something in there on accident. I'm like, ah, that's all right.
do you know the one more the final representation of dragons that I find really interesting, if you don't mind, is dragons in video games because and maybe this would be the focus of a whole other video. So I
Mm.
just want to touch on it briefly.
Sure.
But we're talking about dragons being the unconquerable primordial representation of nature or representation of cosmic horror or basically the thing above ourselves.
Sure.
And yet in video games, dragons are the final boss, or very often something that is by design to be conquered. I mean, Charizard, is often, one of the Pokemon that you have to fight, depending on which one you
Yeah.
choose.
Funny
Dragon
enough,
Quest, yeah.
sorry not to interrupt you. Funny
Oh,
enough,
no.
what is the single Pokemon card that's the most coveted and hardest to find and the most valuable? It's that base set Shadowless Charizard, right?
Is it
That's what
really?
everybody wants. Yeah, that's like so it's funny how even that worked out that this is like the final boss in that sense.
I am obsessed with Pokemon card unboxing videos. I'm
They're
obsessed.
great. They're
Yeah.
great.
So I was going to say, Dragon Quest is another one. The series is called Dragon Quest, and I found it really interesting. In the original game, the dragon that you have to beat in Dragon Quest isn't even the final boss. He's the midway boss. He's the thing that
Hmm.
gatekeeps the first half of the game, and it's the Dragon Lord, who's kind of like a humanoid
Hmm.
entity
Okay.
called the Dragon Lord, is the final boss. So I just find it really interesting that in Skyrim too, I've got Dark Souls written down here. All these dragons are meant to be beaten. They are meant to be conquered. And I
Yeah.
think video games have a lot to kind of interrogate here because they've taken the thing that is supposed to be unbeatable and made it fundamentally beatable. And I think that's really, really interesting.
Hmm.
And I wonder how that's going to continue. I hope it just doesn't continue to be the final boss. Because I think
Yeah.
if we make dragons that easily vanquishable, we're taking away from one of the aspects that make them so scary.
Hmm. I like that. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. I wonder if the fact that it's the final boss maybe helps to assuage that a little bit. That it is the sort of the final frontier rather than like the first level thing that you have to kill or whatever.
Yeah.
But I totally hear what you're saying. It's actually funny. I remember one of my favorite. I used to read a lot of nonfiction, like for lack of a better term, like self-help books, right? And one of my favorites is The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. And in that book, I don't know if you've read that one, but in that book he talks about it's all about how to overcome the internal resistance that we feel around creating and being creative and getting the work done that would get us to, having done that creative thing. And one of the analogies that he uses is like resistance, which is any excuse that we make, any blah, 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 any obstacle that's there. Resistance is sort of like a dragon.
Yeah.
And once you slay it, you can move forward. And every time you slay that dragon, it becomes easier to slay the next one that you see. And it's funny to me that even that uses that same analogy of the dragon, being
Yeah.
something that's really difficult to take down. But like you're saying, you still do take it down. And that's interesting. I'd never thought about it in that way, but I can see what you're saying, that maybe that starts to program us a little bit to be like, oh, these aren't that big of a deal. Or these aren't that scary.
But you know what? Just going back to Beowulf, doesn't he die because of the dragon?
Oh, I don't even
But,
know.
but he
Maybe.
conquers, he kills the dragon, but he dies because of it. Is that
Okay.
right? Philip, help us. But if that is the case, then surely that it's kind of both, maybe from
Hmm.
ancient times, right, or Old English times, because we are capable of slaying the dragon, but not without great cost.
Yeah. Ooh,
Going
yeah.
back to the Bible, right? Like, spoiler alert, Satan doesn't win in the Bible,
Yeah.
but man, he exacts a cost. So maybe this is if we just wrap everything back to the ancients, maybe this is where
Yeah.
they've been all along.
Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
On that full circle moment, maybe that's a reasonable place to wrap up, unless you have any additional thoughts to throw out there.
Like and subscribe to Jake.
More like and subscribe to David. Um,
Mate, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I was delighted to be invited by you, and I hope I've given something to support your Google Dog.
of course, yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. This has been amazing. I said it earlier, and I mean it with every fiber of my being. I've been very much looking forward to this. I love talking to you. I love everything about your channel and you as a person. You're just wonderful, and this has been awesome. So thank you so much for taking. It's late at night for you as well, right? So I appreciate
It's
it.
7 o'clock here. I'm not in Kuwait anymore, so it's a bit
Oh, that's
easier.
right. That's right. I don't feel as bad
It's
then.
when I go to Tokyo we're gonna have issues.
Ah, facts, facts. Well,
Yeah.
for now, I'll take back a couple of those nice things that I said because you didn't sacrifice that much. But
Well, I
anyway,
appreciate you.
thank you everybody for watching. If you like the video, hit that like button, hit that subscribe, all that good stuff, whatever. Make sure you go subscribe to David though. Like I said, his channel is just incredible. And talk to us in the comments. What kind of dragons do you like? Maybe that's a good question, right? Engagement, etc. YouTube's algorithm,
Yeah.
whatever.
Philip, Philip.
Philip, summon Philip so he can help us with Beowulf.
Philip's
Um,
gonna watch this. If he does, and be like, why do they keep bringing me? Anyway,
All right. Thanks, everybody. We will see you in the next video.
thanks, guys. Bye.